Continuing page 60. Paradoxically enough, every act of the all-penetrating, eternally wakeful organs over a span of many years was based solely on one article of the 140 articles of the non-general division of the Criminal Code of 1926. One can find more epithets in praise of this article than Turgenev once assembled to praise the Russian language, or Nekrasov to praise Mother Russia. Great, powerful, abundant, highly ramified, multiform, wide-sweeping 58, which summed up the world not so much through the exact terms of its sections as in their extended dialectical interpretation. Who among us has not experienced its all-encompassing embrace? In all truth, there is no step, thought, action, or lack of action under the heavens which could not be punished by the heavy hand of Article 58. The article itself could not be worded in such broad terms, but it proved possible to interpret it broadly. Article 58 was not in that division of the Code dealing with political crimes, and nowhere was it categorized as political. No, it was included with crimes against public order and organized gangsterism in a division of crimes against the state. Thus, the Criminal Code starts off by refusing to recognize anyone under its jurisdiction as a political offender. All are simply criminals. Article 58 consists of 14 sections. In Section 1, we learned that any action, and according to Article 6 of the Criminal Code, any absence of action directed toward the weakening of state power was considered to be counter-revolutionary. Broadly interpreted, this turned out to include the refusal of a prisoner in camp to work when in a state of starvation and exhaustion. This was a weakening of state power, and it was punished by execution, the execution of malingerers during the war. From 1934 on, we were given back the term motherland. Subsections were inserted on treason to the motherland, 1A, B, C, and D. According to these subsections, all actions directed against the military might of the USSR were punishable by execution, 1B, or by 10 years imprisonment, 1A. But the lighter penalty was imposed only when mitigating circumstances were present and upon civilians only. Broadly interpreted, when our soldiers were sentenced to only 10 years for allowing themselves to be taken prisoner, actions injurious to the Soviet military might. This was humanitarian to the point of being illegal. According to the Stalinist code, they should have all been shot on their return home. Here is another example of broad interpretation. I remember well an encounter in the Butyrki in the summer of 1946. A certain Pole had been born in Lemberg, and that city was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War II. He lived in his native city, by then located in Poland. Then he went to Austria, where he entered the service, and in 1945 he was arrested there by the Russians. Since by this time Austrian Lemberg had become Ukrainian Lvov, he received a tenor under Article 54(1)(a) of the Ukrainian Criminal Code, i.e. for treason to his motherland, the Ukraine. And at his interrogation, the poor fellow couldn't prove that treason to the Ukraine had not been his purpose when he went to Vienna, and that's how he conned his way into becoming a traitor. One important additional broadening of the section of treason was its application via Article 19 of the Criminal Code, by intent. In other words, no treason had taken place, but the interrogator envisioned an intention to betray, and that was enough to justify a full term. The same is for actual treason. True, Article 19 proposes that there be no penalty for intent, but only for preparation. But given a dialectical reading, one can understand intention as preparation, and preparation is punished in the same way, i.e. the same penalty as the crime itself, criminal code. In general, we draw no distinction between intention and the crime itself, and this is an instance of the superiority of Soviet legislation to bourgeois legislation, unquote. Section 2 listed armed rebellion, seizure of power in the capital or in the provinces, especially for the purpose of severing any part of the USSR through the use of force. For this, the penalties ranged up to and included execution, as in every succeeding section. This was expanded to mean something which could not be explicitly stated in the article itself, but which revolutionary sense of justice could be counted on to suggest. It applied to every attempt on any national republic to act upon its right to leave the USSR. After all, the word force is not defined in terms of whom it applies to. Even when the entire population of a republic wants to secede, if Moscow is opposed, the attempted secession will be forcible. Thus, all Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Turkestan nationalists very easily received their 10s and their first 25s under this section. Section 3 was assisting in any way or by any means a foreign state at war with the USSR. This section made it possible to condemn any citizen who had been in occupied territory, whether he had nailed on the heel of a German soldier's shoe or sold him a bunch of radishes, and it could be applied to any citizeness who had helped lift the fighting spirit of the enemy soldier by dancing and spending the night with him. Not everyone was actually sentenced under this section because of the huge numbers who had been in occupied territory, but everyone who had been in occupied territory could have been sentenced under it. Section 4 spoke about fantastic aid to the international bourgeoisie. To whom one wonders, could this possibly refer, and yet broadly interpreted, and with the help of a revolutionary conscience, it was easy to find categories. All emigres who had left the country before 1920, i.e. several years before the code was even written, or whom our armies came upon in Europe a quarter century later, in 1944 and 1945, received 58 for 10 years, or execution. What could they have been doing abroad other than aiding the international bourgeoisie? In the example of a young person's musical society already cited, we have seen that the international bourgeoisie could also be aided from inside the USSR. They were in addition aided by all SRs, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks, more socialist, communists. The section was drafted with them in mind, and subsequently by the engineers of the State Planning Commission and by the Supreme Council of the Economy. Section 5 was inciting a foreign state to declare war against the USSR. A chance was missed to apply this section against Stalin and his diplomatic and military circle in 1940 and 1941. Their blindness and insanity led to just that. Who, if not they drove Russia into shame? Who, if not they, drove Russia into shameful, unheard of defeats, incomparably worse than the defeats of Tsarist Russia in 1904 and 1915, defeats such as Russia had never known since the 13th century. Section 6 was espionage. The section was interpreted so broadly that if one were to count up all those sentenced under it, one might conclude that during Stalin's time our people supported life not by agriculture or by industry, but by espionage on behalf of foreigners, and by living on subsidies from foreign intelligence services. Espionage was very convenient in its simplicity, comprehensible both to an undeveloped criminal and to a learned jurist, to a journalist and to public opinion. The breadth of the interpretation of Section 6 lay further in the fact that people were sentenced not only for actual espionage, but for suspicion of espionage, unproven espionage, for which they gave the whole works, and even contact leading to suspicion of espionage. In other words, let us say that an acquaintance of your wife had made a dress by the same seamstress who was of course an NKVD agent used by the wife of a foreign diplomat. These 58.6 suspicion of espionage or contacts leading to suspicion of espionage were sticky sections. They required the strict confinement and incessant supervision of the convicted, for after all, an intelligence service might reach out its tentacles to its protege even in a camp. Also, such prisoners could be moved only under convoy, armed escort. In general, all the lettered articles, which were in fact not articles of the code at all, but frightening combinations of capital letters, and we shall encounter more of them in this chapter, always contained a touch of the enigmatic, always remained incomprehensible, and it wasn't clear at all whether they were offshoots of Article 58 or independent and extremely dangerous. In many camps, prisoners convicted under the provisions of these lettered articles were subjected to restrictions even more stringent than those of the ordinary 58s. Section 7 applied to subversion of industry, transport, trade, and the circulation of money. In the 30s, extensive use was made of this section to catch masses of people under the simplified and widely understood catchword wrecking. In reality, everything enumerated under Section 7 was very obviously and plainly being subverted daily. So didn't someone have to be guilty of it all? For centuries, the people had built and created, always honoring, always honestly, even for serf owners and nobles. Yet not one from the days of Rurik on had ever heard of wrecking. But now, when for the first time all of the wealth had come to belong to the people, hundreds of thousands of the best sons of the people inexplicably rushed off to wreck. Section 7 did not provide for wrecking in agriculture, but since it wasn't impossible otherwise to explain rationally how and why the fields were choked with weeds, why harvests were falling off, why machines were breaking down, then dialectic sensitivity brought agriculture too under its sway. Section 8 covered terror, not the terror from above which the Soviet criminal code was supposed to provide a foundation and basis of legality, but terrorism from below. Terror was construed in a very broad sense, not simply a matter of putting bombs under governors' carriages, but for example, smashing in the face of a personal enemy if he was an activist in the party, the Komsomol, or the police. That was already terror. The murder of an activist especially was always treated more seriously than the murder of an ordinary person, as in the Code of Hammurabi in the 18th century BC. Is that who Dastan is named after? If a husband killed his wife's lover, it was very fortunate for him, if the victim turned out not to be a party member, he would be sentenced under Article 136 as a common criminal, which was a social ally and didn't require an armed escort. But if the lover turned out to have been a party member, the husband became an enemy of the people with a 58-8 sentence. And even more important extension of the concept was attained by interpreting Section 8 in terms of that same Article 19, i.e., intent in the sense of preparation to include not only a direct threat against an activist uttered near a beer hall, just you wait, but also a quick-tempered retort of a peasant woman out at the market. Excuse me. Oh, drop dead. Both qualified as terrorist intent, TN, and provided a basis for applying the article in all its severity. Section 9 concerned destruction or damage by explosion or arson, always with a counter-revolutionary purpose, for which the abbreviated term was diversion. In other words, sabotage. The expansion of this section was based on the fact that the counter-revolutionary purpose could be discerned by the interrogator, who knew best what was going on in the criminal's mind, and every human error, failure, mistake at work or in the production process remained unforgiven, and therefore considered to be a case of diversion. But there was no section in Article 58 which was interpreted as broadly and with so ardent a revolutionary conscience as Section 10. Its definition was propaganda or agitation containing an appeal for the overthrow, subverting, or weakening of the Soviet power, and equally the dissemination or preparation or possession of literary materials of similar content, unquote. For this section in peacetime, a minimum penalty only was set, not any less, not too light. No upper limit was set for this maximum penalty. Such was the fearlessness of the great power when confronted by the word of a subject. The famous extensions of this famous section were as follows. The scope of agitation containing an appeal was enlarged to include a face-to-face conversation between friends, or even between husband and wife, or a private letter. The word appeal could mean personal advice, and we say could mean because in fact it did. Subverting and weakening the government could include any idea which did not coincide with or rise to the level of intensity of the ideas expressed in the newspaper of any particular day. After all, anything which does not strengthen must weaken. Indeed, anything which does not completely fit in, coincide, subverts. And he who sings not with us today is against us, Mayakovsky. It's a line of poetry. The term preparation of literary materials covered every letter, note, or private diary, even when only the original document existed. Thus happily expanded, what thought was there, whether merely in the mind, spoken aloud, or jotted down, which was not covered by Section 10. Section 11 was a special one. It had no independent content or its own, but provided for an aggravating factor in any one of the preceding ones. If the action was undertaken by an organization or if the criminal joined an organization. In actual practice, the section was so broadened so that no organization whatever was required. I myself experienced the subtle application of this section. Two of us had secretly exchanged thoughts. In other words, we were at the beginnings of an organization in other words, an organization. Section 12 concerned itself closely with the conscience of our citizens. It dealt with the failure to make denunciations of any action of the types listed, and the penalty for the mortal sin of failure to make denunciation carried no maximum limit. This section was in itself such a fantastic extension of everything else that no further extension was needed. He knew and he did not tell became the equivalent of he did it himself. Section 13, presumably long since out of date, had to do with the service in the Tsar's secret police, Ukraina. A subsequent form of analogous service was, on the contrary, considered patriotic. Section 14 stipulated the penalties for the conscious failure to carry out defined duties or intentionally careless execution of same. In brief, this was called sabotage or economic counter-revolution. And the penalties, of course, included execution. It was only the interrogator who, after consulting his revolutionary sense of justice, could separate what was intentional from what was unintentional. This section was applied to peasants who failed to come across with food deliveries. It was also applied to collective farmers who failed to work the minimum required a number of labor days, to camp prisoners who failed to complete their work norms, and in a peculiar ricochet, after the war, it came to be applied to members of Russia's organized underworld as thieves, the Blatnia or Blatari, for escaping from camp. In other words, by an extension, a thief's flight from camp was interpreted as subversion of the camp system rather than a dash for freedom. Such was the last rib of the fan of Article 58, a fan whose spread encompassed all of human existence. Now that we have completed our review of this great article of the Criminal Code, we are less likely to be astounded further on. Wherever the law is, crime can be found.